Welcome to an introduction to this gelatinous 3-pound organ that is housed between our ears. Much of what I'm going to give you today we will be going over and over in future lectures, so please do not be alarmed or overwhelmed by the amount of material today. You will continue to hear about this throughout the 3 semesters of clinical practice. These are the objectives that I hope by the end of this lecture you will be able to accomplish. Take a moment to look at them. Now, just for fun, look at these 2 questions and see which answer you would choose. Why don't you jot down your answer on a piece of paper near you, and then at the end of the lecture we'll come back to these and see what you've learned. You probably already know quite a bit about the brain. It's simple if you can count to 4. 1, we all have one brain. 2, each brain has 2 hemispheres, a left and a right, with different functions that we'll look at. 3, we have 3 levels to the brain depending upon which resource you read. Going from top to bottom, we have the cerebral cortex. Then we have what's called the mid area of the brain, or the limbic area. And then at the base of the brain is the cerebellum, or if you go in order of our evolution, it would be the cerebellum, the limbic, and the cerebral cortex levels of the brain. And then we have 4 lobes to the brain. The frontal lobe up there by your eyes, the temporal lobe there down by your ears, the parietal region, which is above your ears, kind of at the corner, back corner of your skull, and then the occipital, which is in the back of your head. Then you can use your fist to remember, and you can't see me doing this now, but if you take your hand in an open hand and then hit the palm of your hand to the butt of your hand there by your wrist, that is the cerebellum. And then if you take your thumb and fold it in over the palm of your hand, that would be considered the limbic region. And in the limbic region we have several areas. We have the amygdala, we have the hippocampus, and we have the hypothalamus. And then if you take your 4 left fingers and fold them over your thumb, you will see that your fingertips are now touching into the palm of your hand, are also touching all through your thumb, and this is the cerebral cortex. It's fairly easy to count to 4 and realize the 1 brain, 2 hemispheres, 3 levels, and 4 lobes. However, the brain also is we're looking at it from an anatomical view. In a few minutes we'll be looking at it from a chemical point of view, and then we also have to keep in mind it is an electrical system, and it is so much more. So whenever we are talking about the brain, we are talking about the anatomy of this 3-pound cauliflower-shaped gelatinous structure between our brains that is involved with all sorts of chemicals and sodium and potassium ions and serotonin and dopamine. And it also is an electrical thing with electrical potentials and everything. So when we talk about the nervous system, we are talking about the central nervous system, which is the brain encased in our skull, and the spinal column. Then also we have the peripheral nervous system, and that is further broken down into a sympathetic or cholinergic nervous system and the parasympathetic anticholinergic. The way I remember this is the sympathetic nervous system is the one that gets us fired up. If I were an ancient cave person and being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, I would want to get out of there. I would somebody be in sympathy with me, and that is the sympathetic nervous system. It is going to widen my eyes so I can see clearly. It's going to make me breathe more deeply. It is going to power up my heart to pump more blood. It's going to shut down my stomach and my bladder and my bowels so I don't have to be worried about that. The parasympathetic nervous system is just the opposite. It is that which is going to bring me back down to my rest and digest state. And so I think of a parachute that brings me down, and the sympathetic is like the missile that sends me off. Now, this is a lot to absorb very quickly, and so I highly recommend that if you have the time, you go to www.thebrain.mcgill.ca for Canada, and you play around there. It is a marvelous website that is divided. It takes the human individual from a social level down to a molecular level and cellular level. It is arranged in three different levels of complexity from beginner to advanced. So please take the time to go through that. Let's take time to look at the brain now, just from an anatomical point of view. And at the top of our spinal column, there is the brain stem, which has three regions in it: the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain. And then that ends or culminates in the cerebellum. The function of the brain stem is to help us maintain attention to what is coming in. It arouses us. It keeps us vigilant. It also is the area that has the autonomic or automatic controls for our respiration, our blood pressure, our heart. Now, these portions of the brain, while important, they don't figure that much in our psychiatric mental health work, but it is like a first alert system. The medulla controlling the heartbeat and breathing, the pons relaying information between the cerebrum and the cerebellum, controlling arousal and regulating respiration, the midbrain, and then the cerebellum, which controls voluntary movement and balance. And again, I invite you to look at www.thebrain.mcgill.ca and gather as much information as you can. In a few minutes, also on the next 3 slides, there will be a chance to watch a tutorial video from another source. Moving upward from the brainstem, we come into the limbic system, or the limbic area of the brain. This is still part of the anatomy of the brain. The brain stem might be called the primitive brain, and then the limbic area is often called the reptilian or the lizard brain. It is a part of the brain structure that we share with many other animals in creation. The limbic area is actually that area that's located on both sides of our head, inside obviously, around the region of our ears in the brain. And it consists of several major areas. The thalamus is a primary relay center. Almost all information coming in from outside through the peripheral nervous system up through the spinal column and into the brain goes through the thalamus. The thalamus then relays it to other areas to tell us what's important and what's not. Then the hypothalamus means it is below the thalamus, and that, along with the amygdala and the hippocampus, are 3 little regions of the brain that are going to be extremely important for us as we continue our study of psych mental health nursing. The amygdala is a small almond shape, and that's where the word amygdala comes from. It means almond shape in Greek. It is a little part of the brain that is more like a warning center. It receives information and immediately begins to apprise, to assess, is this danger or not? And in order to do that, it communicates with the hippocampus, which is a little seahorse-shaped organ in that limbic area. And that hippocampus is a primary center for memory. And then if the amygdala and the hippocampus communicating together decide that, you know what, that thing on the ground that's kind of cylindrical and long is a snake, then the hypothalamus is going to be told, get us into action, and it will then send out chemicals that get the adrenal glands flowing, and adrenaline goes, and the sympathetic nervous system is fired up, and we are out of there. So the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the hypothalamus all work together. The thalamus is a major relay center. Now, there's also this area called the basal ganglia, and depending upon which resource you read, it has a number of different names, but it is primarily that area of the brain that is supporting and helping the rest of the that area of the brain. Sometimes it's called the striatum, so many different names. But the primary functions of the limbic system are to monitor that sensory input, to arouse us if need be. It is an area of great memory, consolidation, and encoding through the hippocampus, and it is hormonal release through the hypothalamus. What you see here is not some MRI image of the brain, but rather it is literally a picture of the flight paths of one of our airlines. My purpose for putting this here is it does give us a metaphor for what the brain is like. You can see how there is so much interconnection of the pathways, and that is the same thing with our brain. Our brain is continually changing. Our experiences and our thoughts cause connections to be made, and over time, as these neurons or brain nerves fire off, they begin to connect, they fire together, and there's an adage in psychiatry that says that neurons that wire together fire together, so that in less than a nanosecond we can make connections and remember complete complex movements with seemingly no effort at all. The brain continually is in communication of one part of the brain to another, and from different parts of the brain to the body, and from the outside world into us, that make all of these connections in nanoseconds. What a marvelous anatomical thing the brain is. Here you see in the shaded box in the center of the brain image what is considered the limbic system or limbic area. And again, depending upon the resource you read, there might be some other region included in this. They do vary slightly from resource to resource. But the primary parts of the limbic system are those that we mentioned: the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the hypothalamus, with the thalamus being the primary relay center. Now, there is also a region called the corpus callosum, and that is a bundle of nerves or neurons that connects one side, the left hemisphere, and the right hemisphere. I heard years ago that in utero there's a hormonal bath that makes the corpus callosum in males less permeable. Thus, there isn't as facile an interaction between the right and the left hemisphere. And traditionally, we are saying that the left hemisphere is more the logical, linear, mathematic side, where the right hemisphere is more the integrating, poetic, metaphoric, holistic side of the brain. Women seem to have the ability, because the corpus callosum is more permeable, to integrate those different functions, whereas men, with the corpus callosum being less permeable, are more prone to be that logical, linear type of thinking. The person who talked about that in utero hormonal bath ended up by saying that that's why men are half-wits and women are whole brain. That's a little bit sexist. I hope you enjoyed the joke. The other area is the reticular activating system in the brainstem, and that's all part of that brainstem that we talked about that helps control and monitor arousal. Now we come to the uppermost layer of the brain, the cerebral cortex, which is evolutionary, the most recent, only several million years old. And that cerebral cortex is divided into 4 different lobes, as you can see here: the frontal, temporal, parietal, and spatial. The cerebral cortex, though, is also that area of the brain that looks so very wrinkly and gives it that cauliflower appearance. These wrinkles and ridges, the wrinkles, the deep fissures, are called sulci, S-U-L-C-I, plural, and the ridges are called gyri, G-Y-R-I, plural. The purpose of that is to actually increase the surface area of the brain. The brain itself is, as we've said, only about 3 pounds and measures about 6 inches from front to back. However, if those wrinkles were spread out, the brain would be almost 300 square inches. So it really is increasing the surface area of the brain to make more connections. The frontal executive area is the area that's going to figure very much in our mental health work. It is the area associated with language. It is the area of intelligence. It is the area of motor function and personality. And that frontal lobe is divided into a prefrontal lobe, a dorsolateral frontal lobe, a ventral medial frontal lobe, an occipital frontal lobe, and a sensory cortex motor lobe. All of those are still considered part of the frontal or executive part of the brain. The area around our ears is the temporal lobe, and that obviously is the area of hearing, but it is also the area associated with language, and it is that area that gives the affective, the emotional content to our language. It is also because that's where the limbic system is, where emotion is centered primarily in the amygdala, and memory is a function of the hippocampus, connected obviously to other parts of the brain. Then the parietal area is that area kind of in the back corner, top of our both sides of our head, and that's what helps me. Like when I put down my coffee cup, and while still looking at you, I'm able to reach over and get that coffee cup. It is that area of the brain that if I begin to fall, my sense of space catches me. It is also that area of the brain when I look at a stop sign, I know it's a stop sign, and I can distinguish that from a yield sign, the symbol recognition. And then the occipital area of the brain in the very back is where our visual cortex is, integrating the encoding symbols that are coming in through our occipital nerves. It is our primary visual area. Very important for us as psych nurse practitioners to understand, especially the importance of the frontal and the temporal lobes because of their executive functioning and their emotional input. For those of you who are more left brain linear, you may appreciate this slide, which again shows you the four lobes of the brain. And on the very far right side, it shows you some of the major functions that are associated with those areas of the brain. In the middle column are some nice mnemonics to help us remember the functions of the executive lobes. The next three slides will have links to video clips that explain much more in detail the anatomy of the brain. I invite you to take time to look at those. In this slide, we try to connect some of the pieces that we've been talking about. We've said that the brain has four lobes, and in psych mental health, the most prominent parts of this will be the frontal lobe with its prefrontal, dorsolateral, optic, frontal, orbital, and ventral medial. Now, if you take your hand like we did right early on, and you fold your thumb across your palm, and then fold your fingers down over your thumb, where your fingernails are up to the middle knuckle would be all the prefrontal area of the brain, and the fingernails could be considered the orbital frontal cortex. Now, if you lift your fingers up slightly and feel where your thumb is touching into your palm, that area right there at the base of your fingers might be considered the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. And it is that ventral medial prefrontal cortex that is so closely aligned and connected to the limbic region of the thumb that is the center for a lot of our emotional life. Now fold your fingers back over, and then with your index finger and your little finger, those are the dorsolateral prefrontal cortexes, the areas so important for brain function of executive power, decision making, and analyzing. All right. Then we've said before that the limbic system is the area of emotion, with the amygdala being the warning center, with the hippocampus being the remembering center, and with the hypothalamus being the communication center, sending messages into the body for fight, flight, or freeze, and then the reverse, rest and digest. Now, please keep in mind that although we talk of these as distinct regions of the brain and assign them specific functions, it's not that cut and dried or segregated. Remember the slide of the flight paths? All of those different communication paths or flights going off from one end of the country to the other? Well, in the brain, each area receives and gives input to multiple other areas of the brain. It is interacting, stimulating, and connecting one part to the other, and it is done through a magnificent complex network of nerves called neurons. The brain has over 100 billion neurons. And those neurons, as we're going to see in the next part of the lecture, have dendrites and receptors and axons and synapses. Well, each of those 100 billion neurons has receptors with over 10,000 possibilities of connecting to other neurons. It's just astronomical, the power of the brain to communicate with itself, with the environment. All right, this ends the first part of this lecture. If you wish, you can use the next slide to connect to Quizlet.com and see how well you have encoded some of this into your hippocampus memory.